Good morning, good day for all of us. So today, I with my friends gonna talk about translation technique. In translation technique, there are 18 technique in translation. The first one is literal translation. Literal translation is a translation technique to translate sentence or phrase with word for word. The example of this technique is the source language is membunuh dua burung dengan satu batu. And the target language is kill one bird with one stone. And the second is reduction. It's a technique in which source language text information is compressed in the target language. And the source language is sakit sekali. And the target language is it's hurt. And the next is modulation. Modulation is a translation technique by changing the point of view, focus, or cognitive category in relation to the source language. This change in perspective can be lexical or structural. The source language is kau akan menangis sebelum aku pergi. And the target language is you will cry before I go. Amplification is to introduce details that are not formulated information, replicative paraphrasing. The example in source language is sementara aku harus kerja keras, kaki mereka terangkat di kursi. And the target language is while I working hard, they just sit there with their feet up on the bed. And the next is transposition. It's a technique by making change in grammatical categories or by shifting categories, structures, and units. And the source language is aku tidak dapat mengendalikan hal ini. And the target language is I have no control over these matters. Linguistic amplification is a translation technique that explicitly or paraphrase information implicit in the source language. The source language is terdapat banyak warga negara Korea yang tinggal di Indonesia. And the target language is there are many Koreans live in Indonesia. Borrowing. The translation borrows a word or phrase from the source language. An example in source language is kami punya kebab untuk makan siang. And the target language is we have kebab for lunch. Kalki. It is a literal translation of foreign word or phrase, and it can be lexical or structural. An example in source language is batik Indonesia merupakan perpaduan dari dua gaya atau tipe. The target language is Indonesian batik style blends two major batik styles. Adaptation. Adaptation is technique is used to replace a source text, cultural or social elements with one from target text, which more familiar for the target readers. An example in source language is kepada yang terkasih, sahabatku An. And the target language is dear my friend N. And the next in translation technique is compensation. This technique is to introduce a source language stylistic effect, element of information in another place in the target language, because it cannot be reflected in the same place as in the source language. And the example in source language is aku sangat terharu oleh tangisan itu. And the target language is I was so moved that I couldn't stop crying. And the next is description. This technique uses description to dictate acceptable to be word or expression from source language which is not understood in target language. An example in source language is saya suka kimchi, and the target language is I like kimchi. Kimchi is a traditional Korean food in the form of pickled fermented vegetables that are given a spicy seasoning. And the next is discursive creation. This technique is employed to establish a temporary equivalent which is different, unpredictable, and out of context. It commonly used for translating book, title, film, or any sort of literary text. And the example of source language is aku sudah menunggumu dari tadi. And the target language is I've been waiting for you from yesterday. Generalization. This technique is employed to use neutral or more general terms. An example of this source language is Becak, Bemo, and Delman. And the target language is a vehicle. And the next is establish equivalent. These techniques apply recognized term or expression in the dictionary or language used as equivalent in target language. The meaning and the style of source language are the same as target language. Example of these techniques is in the source language is Hey Fanny, apa kabarmu? And the target apa kabarmu? And the target language is Hi Fanny, how are you? The next is substitution. This technique is used to substitute a paralinguistic element into a linguistic element or vice versa. An example of this source language is kedua orang Jepang itu memberi salam, and the target language is those two Japanese bow each other. Variation. This translation technique is carried out by changing the linguistic or paralinguistic elements that affect linguistic variation. The example in source language is aduh, sakit sekali, apa ini? Ucap anak ikan kesakitan. And the target language is ah, it's hot. What is it? Said the fish kid in the pain. And the next is particularization. It is the using of a move, precise or concrete term. Example in source language is ayah sayang kamu, apapun yang terjadi. And the target language is I love you no matter what. And the last technique in translation is linguistic compression, is to synthesize linguistic elements in the target language. An example in the source language is pikirkan, ujarnya, ada senyum kecil tersinggung di bibirnya. Nanti kau tak bisa menggantinya lagi. And the target language is think about it. He says, a fine smile curling his lips. You don't get to pick again. And the last one in translation technique is linguistic comprehension. Linguistic comprehension is to synthesize linguistic element in the target language. The example in the source language is pikirkan, ujarnya, ada senyum kecil tersungging di bibirnya. Nanti kau tak bisa menggantinya lagi. And the target language is think about it. He says, a fine smile curling his lips. You don't get to pick again.
Okay, now we'll continue with the procedure of translation. So while translate a text, the translator do not only use one translation technique, but also combine of several techniques. So the first is single translation. It means that while translate a text, the translator just only use one translation technique. And the second is couple translation. It means that while translate a text, the translator combine two translation technique in a single sentence. For example is the combination of reduction and borrowing translation. In source language, mereka telah memberi keterangan yang tidak benar dalam memperoleh visa. Translate into target language, they provided incorrect information in obtaining a visa. And the next is triple translation. Triple translation technique is the application of three translation technique in one sentence. For example is the combination of transposition and cargo and literal translation. In source language, setiap orang yang masuk atau keluar wilayah Indonesia wajib memiliki dokumen perjalanan yang sah dan masih berlaku. Translate into target language, every people who enter or exit the Indonesian territory shall be obligated to have a legal travel document and still valid. And the last is quadruple translation. Quadruple translation means that the translator combine four translation techniques in a single sentence to produce the natural forms and get the appropriate meaning in the target language. For example is the combination of reduction and transference and naturalization and cultural equivalent translation. For example is source language, ketika tiba di apartemen ada tulisan untuk disewa dan manajer bilang John sudah pindah sejak akhir April. Translate into target language, when they arrived at the apartment, there was a for rent sign up, and the manager said that John had moved out at the end of April. So here, they as a reduction, and the word of transfer is apartment and manager and April. And for the cultural equivalent is the word of foreign. So that is for procedure of translation that often used in a translate a text. So we can discuss about translation methods. So in translation methods, there are two groups. They are domestication and foreignization. So we can start from domestication. Okay, now we'll continue with the domestication. So domestication, it is emphasized on the target language. So there are four translation methods in this ideology. The first is communicative translation method. It is tries to render the exact contextual meaning of the original in such a way that both contents and language are readily acceptable and comprehensible to the readership. And the second is idiomatic translation method. Idiomatic translation reproduces the message of the original, but tends to distort nuance of meaning and preferring idioms where these do not exist in the original. And the third is free translation method. So in free translation method, it's a part of emphasis of the target language, which reproduce the matter without the manner, or the content without the form of the original. And the last is adaptation translation method. It is used to translate literary works such as comedy and short story. And the source language culture is converted to the target language culture and the text written. And the example of domestication is in source language, kami sudah biasa makan dengan tangan di Sumatera, apalagi kalau makan di restoran Padang. Translate into target language, we have gotten used to eating with our fingers in Sumatra, especially in the local restaurant. And the second is in source language, sudah malam tidurlah, kalau tidak, kau tak perlu pergi besok. Aku khawatir kau masuk angin kelelahan. And translate into target language, it's late, go to sleep. If you don't get some sleep, you won't be able to go tomorrow morning, and you are going to catch a chill. And now we continue with the group 2, this foreignization. So it's emphasis of the source language. The method that used in this ideology are the first is word-to-word translation methods. Word-to-word translation is often demonstrated as interlinear translation, with the target language immediately below the source language words, and the source language words order is preferred and the words translate singly, but their most common meanings are out of the context. And the second is literal translation methods. So the source language grammatical construction are converted to their nearest target language equivalents, but the lexical words are again translated singly out of context. It means that when translator translate, the words are translated literally from source language into target language. And the third is faithful translation methods. So it attempts to reproduce the precise contextual meaning of the original within the context of the target language grammatical structures. And the last is semantic translation methods. Semantic translation methods may translate less important culture words by culturally neutral third or functional terms, but not by culture equivalent, and it may make offer small concessions to the readership. And the example of this is, the first is, in source language, orang Butung mengadakan pencak silat rame-rame. Translate into target language, men from Butung perform pencak silat martial arts in large groups. And the second is, in source language, dia membuat matah dari siraman air panas dan perasan jeruk nipis. Translate into target language, she made a matah sauce from hot oil and lime juice. Okay, as a conclusion, our material, so the first is, according to Molina and Albir, the exchange translation technique, and the second is, according to Denmark, there are two groups in translation methods. There is domestication that emphasizes of the target language, and foreignization that emphasizes on the source language. And the last is, while translate a text, we need to know that the translator often combine more than two translation technique while translate a text. So that is all about our presentation. So we say thanks to all of you. Thank you.